Oh, and we're back. All right, so we resume. We've gotten, at this point, to 1954 and the origins of what becomes direct U.S. policy, U.S. involvement in at least the southern half of Vietnam. And I think I'll move through a few of these things kind of quickly at this point. Not because they're unimportant, but because I have quite a lot to get through. Also in 1954, at the same time that Diem is chosen to head this experiment, a university is tapped to try and build a government structure around Nhat and Diem, and that university is the Michigan State University, MSU, and the MSUG stands for, which is this way, I suppose. The MSUG is the Michigan State University Vietnam Advisory Group. It's kind of a mouthful. Michigan State University Vietnam Advisory Group. Now, this is, I think, it ties in fairly well with the stuff we talked about a few minutes ago, and that is the university and empire kind of stuff, and the heavy involvement of universities, both elite and non-elite schools, in nation-building, modernization kinds of programs. MSU's story is a little bit different in that they have certain people at MSU have a very direct link with Nhat and Diem. One of those is a political science professor named Wesley Fischel, whose name is F-I-S-H-E-L, Wesley Fischel, political science prophet at MSU. He had met Diem back in 1950, and they had had a correspondence and then established a bit of a relationship once Diem lived in the United States, and they corresponded frequently. And Fischel was a huge advocate of propping up Diem as the leader of this new state, this new modern, what they were going to call South Vietnam. When Fischel, when he gets on the ground in southern Vietnam, this is in, he's there, I think he's there in around June or so in 54, then he comes back again in October of 54, or in September of 54. He writes what he finds. He writes back in a report in September, he says, quote, "I've never seen a situation like this. It defies imagination. The government is shaky as all hell. It is being propped up for the moment only with great difficulty. Nothing can help it so much as administrative, economic, and social reforms. The needs are enormous, the time short," unquote. So Fischel is saying pretty much what Mansfield had said, and pretty much consistent with the findings of the National Intelligence Estimate, and that is, the place is a nightmare. There's a hell of a lot of work to be done. And the point I make in using these, and there are many others I could use, but the point I make in kind of laying out their observations of southern Vietnam is that they recognize what officials later do not recognize, and that is they know that their objective is to build a new state. Ultimately, we'll get into Kennedy and Johnson. They stop saying this altogether. It's as if they don't know that this is what happened. They don't recognize that really the objective had been to build a new state, to develop a modern South Vietnam, something that had never in history existed. So Mansfield gets it, Fischel gets it, all the folks involved in the MSUG, they get it. They know that their objective, their number one goal is to build a brand new state out of southern Vietnam, and to do it very, very quickly, because they're going to be overrun by events in 56. If they haven't done it by 56, technically, elections will be held, and all their schemes and plans will be scuttled. So, in 1954, this American mission, the U.S. mission, kind of descends on southern Vietnam. Diem is put in place. The MSU and 10 or 12 consultants are flown in. They're accountants, economists, political scientists, police experts who train a police force. The military, meanwhile, is very, very rapidly recruiting a military and arming it and training it to support Diem. They go to work immediately on training bureaucrats, to training people in public finance, accounting, all kinds of different positions in creating a workforce, a civil service, basically, out of whatever Vietnamese they can recruit. This is kind of a crash program in nation building. Over the course of, and this is the part of U.S. involvement in southern Vietnam that I think is so poorly understood, yet so critically important. Over the course of the years 1954 to 1960, the U.S. pours into Vietnam $1.4 billion in economic aid. $1.4 billion. And in those years, that was a considerable sum of money. It's not like much now, but it's a hell of a commitment to build a new state. Now, what do they get for that? What do they get for that money? Well, the MSUG, it has a very, very ambitious goal. It lays out this goal very early on that it's going to create what they call there's a presidential project where they'll create a cabinet and kind of a legitimate presidential structure like the executive branch of the American system. They'll create, through what's the NIA, it's the National Institute of Administration, they'll create this school for training bureaucrats. They have this really ambitious program, and they're being funded heavily, millions and millions of dollars. They're under contract with the American government. It's a tripartite agreement, if I can use that term, but it's the MSU, the American government, and the regime in Saigon are all under contract, and the MSU is supposed to build all this stuff. The MSU ultimately, because they find that the security situation is so very bad, they end up undertaking a massive police training program that dwarfs all their other programs. They come back after their initial October assessment. In early '55, they issue another report saying, basically, we were way off. Things are bad. We're going to need to double the police force. So they planned for a 45,000-man police force. They planned for the creation of a VBI, a Vietnamese Bureau of Investigation, which is mirrored on the FBI. They're going to create a VBI in Vietnam, and it's going to be ultimately staffed with about 6,500 officers. They institute an identity card program that will catalog the identities of everybody in southern Vietnam. Very ambitious. But now the measures are aimed pretty much exclusively at security, beefing up security. The army around Diem is growing, the police force is growing, and it just explodes in the late 50s and early 60s. 45,000 turns out to have been a very, very conservative estimate. It ends up well over 150,000 strong. That's apart from the army. So, now if you remember back moments ago, we talked about modernization and what these planners, when they're kind of in their clinical settings, doing their research and writing their programs for building nations, the kinds of things they said are not going to exactly play out. Diem is expected to reform. He's expected to put in place certain kinds of features, like an open system, like a political infrastructure that is answerable to the people via elections or some other structure. But he's supposed to create a kind of an open, liberal regime that recognizes the rights of these disparate groups and different religious sects and different people. Diem doesn't do that. And the reason Diem doesn't do that is because Diem has almost no power base. So he uses, and this has become the common feature of the entire period of Diem rule, Diem uses American aid, he uses American money, American power to buttress his own position because he doesn't have any other way to do it. He has almost no support base. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Catholics who are ferried out of the north into the south, and they become kind of his support base. But they're not armed, they're not trained, they don't make for much of a support base in the absence of considerable American aid. So Diem then begins to, one by one, eliminate enemies. He does this first, he does it in a political referendum that is a complete farce. In '55, they hold what is, it's not really an election, it's a referendum. And your choice is between a guy named Bao Dai, who's this kind of slippery eel-like character who nobody really trusts. One French official said, Bao Dai is very shy, kind of like apologizing for him. And a State Department official said, of course he's shy, he doesn't want to get shot. He's not a very popular figure. He's seen as kind of a French lackey. He has, concubines and girlfriends too numerous to count. And when you go to vote on the day of the referendum, there's a placard side by side, Diem's picture and Bao Dai's picture. In Bao Dai's picture, if you want to check here and vote for Bao Dai, it says underneath, it's comical. Under the caption says, basically, if you want to continue to live under imperial rule of the blah, 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 the noted philanderer and whatever. And then on Diem's it says, if you want to embark on a new, exciting blah, blah, nation, modern, it's just the stark difference. So you're sitting there thinking, let's see, my choice is, who the hell, this is difficult. 98% of the vote goes to Diem. 98%. Now, we're talking about the Chicago politics. This is a classic example of a farcical election. In many instances, Diem wins thousands more votes than there are people living in the districts. This happens just repeatedly. A number of people tell him, there's an Edward Lansdale, who I'll talk about in a second, but Edward Lansdale, who's a kind of a genuine old spook, a good CIA guy, he tells him, look, you can probably get away with it. I mean, it'll seem legitimate if you win like 60%. Diem balks. No way. Must have more than that. So he demands a high percentage. Can you imagine? If you win an election, you can just demand. What percentage would you like to win by? 98. Done. 98.2% of the vote. Right. 98.2% of the vote goes to Nixon Diem. So this is considered, at least by certain U.S. supporters of Diem and by Diem, as kind of legitimating his rule. He's now got the mandate of the people, all of them, except for slightly less than 2% who will soon be in jail. We've got the support from all the people to remove Bao Dai and begin this new program, to begin to build this new state. And so Diem begins to quickly use, once he's removed him, he begins to use the military to crush other opponents. There are numerous other opponents and nationalist groups, and the Buddhists, for example, that become a huge problem for Diem. The Benjuin, which is they're often called gangsters. I don't know if that's really the best way to describe them. They basically have much of the urban environment cut up into kind of cartels. They control prostitution and gambling, and they control kind of the nightlife of most of Saigon and the environs of Saigon. They control the police force as well. The French kind of handed them over to the Benjuin on their way out. And so Diem uses the force to undercut the Benjuin. He defeats them soundly. And so the Americans are basically saying, this is going fairly well, actually. He's eliminating what are really kind of messy alternatives we'd have to deal with otherwise. I mean, there are considerable pockets of power. There are considerable other groups kind of vying for power and influence and who would want to participate in whatever kind of government that was created. So if you truly create a representative government in southern Vietnam, then you would have the Wahho, a religious sect, you'd have the Cao Dai, a nationalist sect, you'd have the Benjuin, and you'd have the Buddhists. You'd have these different, and there are others too. You'd have all these different groups represented within this structure. Diem doesn't want that, because if it's truly a representative government, then the representation within the National Assembly, which is 125 or so people ultimately, the representation in there probably would vote to have less American involvement in their affairs. They know that with Diem, he will never opt for that. He'll never opt for less American involvement, particularly when that involvement, that heavy, heavy American involvement, is responsible for his very survival. So Diem never says, we need less of your involvement. In fact, Diem says we need much more. He's always on record constantly complaining he doesn't have enough aid. Now, when it comes to sending in personnel, the American troops and advisors, Diem is much more circumspect. But in terms of dollars, economic aid, military aid, Diem wants more and more and more and more. And he uses it to build around himself a very, very tight system of security, an elaborate military and police network, and he crushes all of his opposition. So he handpicks the students that the MSUG trains in the NIA, the National Institute of Administration. He handpicks these people. Dozens and dozens of them are flown back to the U.S. to get degrees in accounting and the like in the United States. He handpicks those people. People who become trainees into police programs, Diem handpicks those people. In the Army, he handpicks the officer corps. In the National Assembly, he handpicks over 2/3 of all of its members. And Fischel, until his death in 1977, remains an ardent supporter of Nixon Diem. He begins to have his doubts here and there, but by and large, Fischel is very much a supporter of Nixon Diem. And he refers, not sarcastically, he means this, he refers to this structure that Diem has created as Diem's democratic one-man rule. He writes an article called Diem's Democratic One-Man Rule, which is a very clear contradiction in terms. There's no such thing as a democratic one-man rule. There's a one-man rule, and then there's a democratic rule. Diem has created around himself a one-man rule, a dictatorship. In the course of the years from 1954, actually 1956 or so, when he really solidifies his power, up into the early 1960s, Nixon Diem has placed in jail or in re-education camps several 100,000 people. In the tens of thousands, nobody ever released the numbers on this, in the tens of thousands have been assassinated and executed by the police and the military forces and paramilitary forces. And Diem has refused all reform from the United States. Some superficial stuff he will allow, but by and large, he's refused to reform, to the point that by the early 60s, he's really begun to piss off all of his American patrons. You had a question? Can you use the mic?
I was just about to ask if we actually specified that all the money we gave him go to military, or if we actually tried to get him to set up infrastructure in the country. So.
Yeah, it is made fairly clear to him. In fact, numerous times, they come really close to threatening Diem, openly threatening Diem. Ambassadors do this. Military guys do this, openly threatening him. And the documentary record is just replete with these back and forth toings and froings from Diem to American officials. And they're just constantly bemoaning, my God, the guy won't listen. But you can't cut off the aid. What do you do? So you go to Diem and you say, and incidentally, by 1960, they're sending in $250 million annually in aid. So it's a substantial little aid program. So you go to Diem and you say, all right, look, you reform, open up your system, allow for provincial and district elections, or we're going to cut off aid. What does Diem say? He says, cut off aid. Are they going to cut off aid? Hell no. See, that's his ace in the hole. Diem knows. They're never going to cut off aid. What alternative do they now have? By 1960, Diem has crushed all opposition. He's eliminated every rival for power. There's no other credible nationalist who is anti-communist. Every other rival for power now wants an accommodation with the North. So you're trapped. There's a really good book on this by a guy named David Anderson called Trapped by Success. And I think that says it all. By 1960, they were trapped by success. They were saying publicly, when they needed to say anything at all about Vietnam, they were saying, it's going well. Look, we put the guy in place. The state is rapidly unfolding around the guy. Everything's going well. He's a progressive, he's a democratic one-man rule, right? Really what was happening was a dictatorship was flourishing in southern Vietnam. But they couldn't say that. And Diem knew they couldn't say it. And Diem knew that they might threaten, they might admonish, they might criticize, but ultimately, at the end of the day, they're never going to rescind all that aid. They're never going to cut off aid. If they cut off aid, even for a few months, what will happen? Diem will cease to be. The regime will no longer exist. This would probably have happened within weeks, not months. Diem would have ceased to exist. So that's the MSUG's work. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but I don't have a week to do this. The MSUG is responsible primarily for the buildup of an elaborate police network and a Vietnamese Bureau of Investigation to allow Diem to bring about greater security to protect himself. Now, there's something also, the MSUG does not operate in isolation. There's something called the USOM, the United States Operations Mission, that works directly with the MSUG. So this is part of what's called the U.S. mission. There's this military component, there's this USOM, and then there's MSUG. It's always this multifaceted program. The United States Operations Mission is the body that is supposed to oversee all economic aid to the experiment. So they really have the purse strings. At least once the money's been allocated, they have the purse strings. They kind of decide what programs get emphasized, what programs get cut. And one of the things that the USOM employs, and this is a critical little feature, I mean, it probably shows up when it shows up at all as only a detail, and it's a bit complicated to explain, but I'm going to give it a shot because I think it's critically important. The CIP, the Commercial Import or Commodity Import Program. The Commodity Import Program. And I promise I'll keep this very, very brief. If you go into a country with hundreds of millions of dollars, a country particularly that is underdeveloped, you take in several hundred advisors, lots and lots and lots and lots of military equipment and hardware, $250 million annually into what is completely an absent economy, what will be the result? Inflation, incredible inflation, right? This is the danger. In Iraq, this has been talked about. If you infuse what is a pretty limited economy with huge, you can imagine the equivalent would be if you shocked Houston with, say, 50,000 new immigrants every year. Just that 50,000 new people looking for jobs. It would give you that sense of, it would really shock the economy. Then you waited a year, did it again, it would just keep it, you'd be in a constant state of shock and recovery. War tends to do this, especially when the host is like a Vietnam or a Korea or any other place like that. They need a device that will prevent runaway inflation. They settle on this device, the Commodity Import Program. Why is there inflation? First of all, there is way more spending power than there would be otherwise without a war, or it's not a war yet, without a massive aid program. There's way more spending power. So you're basically flooding southern Vietnam with lots and lots and lots of capital. You're giving huge economic aid to the regime. huge economic aid that trickles down to workers who are helping get all the stuff into the country. And then there are the Americans and other third country nationals who are spending lavishly in southern Vietnam. So what you do is you create much, much more capacity for spending than you can possibly sop up, and inflation through the roof. The solution is import stuff. Just send them stuff, free. So it's very, very simple, actually. I mean, the details of it get rather complicated, but if your problem is you have way more spending power, just start unloading goods. Especially Saigon, just dump goods in. And they send in crazy stuff like Honda motor scooters and jet skis, or water skis and the like, tons of wristwatches, cigarettes and soda and clothing and just name it, music of various kinds, radios and TVs, and in prodigious quantities are flooding into southern Vietnam to soak up. Imagine these commodities like a giant sponge, and it goes in to just soak up excess spending capacity, and it keeps a lid on inflation. Yes, sir.
Wasn't this whole process one of the areas where the Japanese economy came back so strong? Because the Japanese shipped so much stuff into Southeast Asia.
Later that becomes the case, and with South Korea too. Both of them will ship. They get good contracts in southern Vietnam when the war heats up. Particularly South Korean businessmen tap into this pipeline, and they get really lucrative contracts to aid. That's the exchange the South Koreans make with the United States. You want us to send in our troops, which they do, right? The ROC sends in troops to South Vietnam to fight. In exchange, we want these kind of sweetheart deals, these commercial arrangements, which they get when the war heats up. Use the button.
Is like with the CIP, is like our government subsidizing, like paying our companies to send this in? So like, all right, so it's pumping money back into our economy by.
Absolutely.
All right.
The way that it works, it seems kind of nightmarish, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense in economic terms. But the U.S., when it sends these commodities in, the U.S., this is part of the aid package. The U.S. actually pays exporters in America for those goods, and then they are flooded into southern Vietnam, and nobody necessarily has to pay for them on that end, except that they are eventually sopped up in southern Vietnam. And so it stymies inflation. Now, that's that, right? Why am I telling you this? Because flooding southern Vietnam with heavy, heavy commodity goods will mean no local production. It's as if Walmart comes into your small town and reduces all of its retail prices by 40%. And the next year, you have no small business. Local production can't get off the ground when there is such an efficient program as is the aid program. They're sending in stuff really cheaply, and lots of it. High-end, quality goods for a middle class. A small middle class, but a middle class nevertheless. Where are they going to buy from? There's no contest. Those things aren't produced locally. And the commodity import program, this is why I say this at the outset, the commodity import program is going to be one of the key features of the overall aid program that undermines ever building a nation. When we get into the 60s, you'll see that this is hopelessly lost. By 65 or so, the decisions are made that it's completely unrealistic to think that this could ever be achieved. The CIP then is still around, and it mushrooms to several $100 million a year, just by itself, because they don't want inflation. There's a good quote by, I think it's an aid administrator, an AID, the Agency for International Development, I'll talk about in a second, who said, when asked about the problem of inflation, he said, look, the price of rice could put much bigger mobs in the streets than the Buddhists can muster. Inflation is a huge problem. It'll sap the support of that middle class. It'll ruin the economy, and no one will be able to buy basic staples, foodstuffs, and clothes and the like. And once that happens, you can forget about it. You will never win those people back. So they put the CIP in place to try and prevent inflation, to maintain an artificially high standard of living for a core of people around Saigon so they can continue to rapidly try and build the state. You got me? Please, if you have any questions, stop me. And these things get a little bit complicated, but necessary, I think. So this is what you have. Between 1954 and 59, the CIP is responsible for $1 billion in goods into Vietnam. $1 billion in 4 years and change. So it's a mammoth program. So what happens? They're rapidly trying to build the state. They're putting all these features in place. They're trying to build a governmental structure around Diem to kind of buttress him. The police is expanding, the army is expanding. Meanwhile, a resistance is also expanding. And it takes the form in 1960 of the National Liberation Front, the NLF. The National Front, it's actually the National Front for the Liberation of Vietnam, but it's the NLF. Diem and some American officials refer to it derisively as the VC, the Viet Cong. These probably terms you've heard before, the VC and the Viet Cong. These are derisive terms that describe a much, much broader resistance movement. The National Liberation Front is that. It's communist-led, but it involves a much more diverse group of people than just that. And it's grassroots. Most of it is internal to southern half of Vietnam, and it's a huge problem. So Vietnamese people have come to oppose what they see as the imposition of something that's relatively alien. A new kind of leadership under Diem that is authoritarian, that is repressive. Diem abandons all kinds of land reform programs. None of the aid that's coming into the country actually trickles into the provinces. So there's no real benefit to having Diem, and there's this kind of overt American presence and an overt military police security presence in the countryside. I didn't even get into this, but there's a whole body of police called the Civil Guard, which expands to huge numbers, tens of thousands of Civil Guard, and they're explicitly paramilitary. They're not police, so they go into villages and just ransack villages looking for enemy. And it creates just kind of a nightmare situation where it doesn't exactly win the hearts and minds. It doesn't make Diem any more legitimate, but American aid continues to make him the only candidate. So now we get into the early 60s, and John Kennedy adopts this thing. Now you know what's there. This is what's there. This is what Kennedy comes into the White House and finds. In his first days, and it might be his first day or two, Edward Lansdale comes into the office. Kennedy's kind of asked for a meeting with Lansdale. Lansdale's been on the ground in Vietnam, kind of knows some stuff about it. So he asked for a meeting, and Lansdale comes in with this report. It's Edward Lansdale. And Lansdale's report it's kind of frightening. It's urgent. It's Lansdale saying the situation is bad. I don't know what you've heard, but it's bad. And unless we really step up our efforts there, we're going to be booted out in a matter of weeks. And it sort of shakes Kennedy. And Kennedy embarks on this bold new program. Kennedy vastly expands American involvement in Vietnam. And for a whole complicated series of a set of reasons that I won't go into, Kennedy basically decides on Vietnam as the place. He's kind of looking to prove his mettle around the world. He's a young guy, he's brash, he's tremendously confident, but he's unproven. And he knows that he's kind of viewed this way by folks like Khrushchev, that he's viewed as inexperienced and a bit immature when it comes to international affairs. Kennedy seizes on Vietnam to make a name for himself. He's lost in Cuba, an episode that Bob has gone over, and you didn't go over that yet, an episode that Bob will go over. And he loses out in Laos, which is a much less visible affair, but it nevertheless stings John Kennedy. So Kennedy comes into office riding the wave of what's called this new frontier. His campaign slogan is the new frontier. And immediately, after talking with Lansdale, he embarks on this new program. Oddly, it's also the CIP. It's a counterinsurgency program. Somebody plans this thing. This is all written up, very detailed, and they sort of hand this to Kennedy and say, look, this is our program. You wanted to step things up. You wanted to get serious. Kennedy's statement is, we need to get moving in Vietnam. So they hand him the counterinsurgency program, which involves ramping up aid, military aid to Diem, expanding the force from, I think his military is 150,000, and the CIP calls for expanding it to 170,000, expanding the Civil Guard, expanding the police forces, and expanding America's direct involvement there. So across the board, Kennedy decides in the first very early part of his administration, ramp up the situation in Vietnam. He's told by Lansdale and others, if you don't, we're going to be moved out of Vietnam unceremoniously. And so he dramatically begins to expand American involvement there. And there are two hallmarks of Kennedy policy in Vietnam. There's much more to it than that, but those are the ones I want to deal with. And they are right here. Whoops. Strategic hamlets and counterinsurgency. These are the two pillars of Kennedy policy in southern Vietnam. So, first, counterinsurgency I'll just do very briefly. Counterinsurgency is a military component of U.S. policy. It's not a charity program, it's not aid handout, it's not economic development, it's counterinsurgency. It's to fight insurgents. And so Kennedy inaugurates this new program, along with his precious Green Berets, to become a different kind of soldier. Highly mobile, much lighter and faster, able to fight guerrillas. So it's to be a very different, innovative thing in the military. They're to train the Southern Vietnamese forces to fight this way, and he sends over thousands and thousands and thousands of American servicemen to fight this way, although they're technically advisors. So that's counterinsurgency. There's to be these sweeps into the countryside to remove the insurgency, to begin to really take on the insurgency, to try and end it, and coupled with that, strategic hamlets. Strategic hamlets. This is a very novel kind of concept. It's not new, but it's new to Kennedy. This had been going on, the loosely conceived, the idea of strategic hamlets had been going on for some time, since the 50s in Vietnam. And all it is you take the southern half of Vietnam and you go in wherever you have bad spots, wherever you got your thumbtacks on the map on the wall that tell you that this area is not loyal to us. This area, we have tremendous activity there, that's insurgent activity. There's a lot of resistance here, there's the resistance here. So you go into these areas and you create strategic hamlets. Either you remove the enemy from within the hamlets and then you put a barbed wire fence around the hamlet, or you bulldoze the entire hamlet and you move it someplace else into something you've already built. It's walled off, there's a moat, bamboo fence, watchtowers on every corner, and within it there is a hamlet. A hamlet, by the way, is not a dwelling. A hamlet is a series of dwellings. A hamlet's like a small neighborhood. So there might be, they vary a great deal. 10 or I don't know, several hundred families anyway living within a hamlet. So it's a fairly large entity. It's not like you're securing a structure, one thatched hut. So strategic hamlets begins officially in the spring of '62, and they sweep out, and as advisors of all kinds in the military sweep into the countryside and begin to raise certain villages, that is, tear them to the ground, move their inhabitants into these strategic hamlets, and in some cases they fortify existing villages. And I actually have, and I think these are going to, I think they reproduce fairly well actually. This is can we have a look at that? Yeah, this does not need to be expanded. That works very well the way it is. This is a shot of southern Vietnamese soldiers. These are Vietnamese soldiers here with weapons, guarding over Vietnamese villagers who are being asked to dig. You can see behind, this is a moat. They're going to dig a large trench, and then within it will be the hamlet. In many cases, and this is a good example of this, southern Vietnamese had to contribute their own labor with no recompense. They weren't paid for this, to building these strategic hamlets under the watchful eye of a guard with a gun. So by day you'd be a rice farmer, you'd farm your fields, which is a full-time job, and then at night or in the afternoon or on off days you would come and lend your hand to the construction of the hamlet, which was about to be your new home. Now this next image, this is one that's completed. I don't know if you can see, you definitely can see the watchtower, but can you see there's a whole string of barbed wire here. Not just a barbed wire fence. Oh, sure, yeah, let's do that. Is that going to, wrong way. Yeah, can you see down at the bottom? The barbed wire is laid from, they're like two rows of fence, and the barbed wire is strung from fence to fence to fence in this kind of zigzag pattern. So the idea is that the strategic hamlets are, if nothing else, they're fortified. This is about security. This is another shot of, let me zoom out a bit on that. Whoops. This is villagers working to build a strategic hamlet. Press the mic, yeah.
The rice farms were contained within the hamlet as well? Their farms?
No, the farms were not. That's a good question. The fields were outside the hamlets. The fields were, you couldn't contain all the fields, right? But the villagers were contained within the hamlets. It's a good question because it brings up a critical problem. You can't really contain everything. And the insurgents, the resistance, they don't wear uniforms. So they are the rice farmers. They are the grandmothers and the mothers and the daughters and the sons and the fathers and the kids. The insurgents are everybody. So when you police up all the people in this way, you're policing up who? You're policing up friend and foe. You're policing up people who were nominally opposed, were perhaps supportive, were indifferent, were actively opposed. You're policing all of them up. And you create a closed environment within which the insurgents can recruit like mad. It becomes a really effective recruiting tool. This is the outer wall of a hamlet. You can see in the immediate foreground is a moat. That's the water. And then the fence is made up of a vertical section of fencing, and then sticking out from that are what are called punji sticks. They're sharpened punji stakes. And what you can't see is that beneath the water, there are also rows and rows of punji sticks in the ditch, under the surface of the water. So if anybody comes into the moat, they'd be impaled on the punji sticks. It's a very common feature of a strategic hamlet. In the immediate environs of the hamlet, they're littered with bombs, anti-personnel devices, and they're referred to as no man's land in the immediate outskirts of a strategic hamlet. So if you don't, when you leave the gate, if you don't take the path, if you take some other course, you'll be exposed to mines and the like. So I wanted to show a few of those images so you get the idea that, because some at the time couched this as a modernization experiment, right? We're going to kind of rebuild the villages and modernize them. We'll take them books and we'll provide them with medical care and we'll read to them and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. And some of that stuff happened. And they dug wells and the like. And they put Band-Aids on sores, no doubt. But this is primarily, make no mistake about it, this is a security program. And the Vietnamese perceive it as a security program. By 63, actually slightly more than a year after it's begun, the regime boasts that it has established over 3,000 strategic hamlets. This is October of 63. 3,000 strategic hamlets. By the next month, that they boast that they have established 7,000 secure hamlets. Just before Ngo Dinh Diem dies, I've given away the end, just before Ngo Dinh Diem is executed, the regime claims to have established and secured 7,000 hamlets, housing upwards of 8 million people. So if you go according to those numbers, they basically have secured all of southern Vietnam, pretty much all of it. There is a total population in southern Vietnam of 13 million people. So if you have 8 or 9 million of those in hamlets, you're really on your way, provided they do what you say they do. If they are a modernizing force, if the people in them do think you legitimate, if they do pay their taxes, they don't mind what's going on, then you've done it. You're absolutely successful. However, as you might well imagine, they weren't very successful. It didn't work all that well. And they begin to find out immediately following Ngo Dinh Diem's death. In November of 1963, Diem is assassinated. And the reason for that, and I'm having to kind of abbreviate here, the reason for that is because Diem continued to provoke crisis after crisis after crisis. He was not considered legitimate by important sections of southern Vietnam, notably the Buddhists. And the Buddhists mount numerous demonstrations protesting Diem's rule. In May of 63, this is not even a protest against Diem. In May of 63, Buddhists gathered to celebrate the Buddha's birthday. This is May the 8th, 1963. In response to this, Catholic authorities around Diem cut off the loudspeakers and shut it down, and they move in to crush this movement, which they think is a threat to them. It's not. It's a celebration of the Buddha's birthday. In the process, they fire into the crowd and they roll through with tanks. They kill 2 or 3 women and 8 children, and they crush 14 other people, injure them. Either they're crushed or shot in the melee. So you're talking about a fairly significant. There are only several hundred gathered, so it's a significant episode. And it's completely chaotic. People and bullets are flying everywhere, and they're armored personnel carriers and tanks all in the streets. It's complete mayhem. The next day, the Buddhists respond by gathering 10,000 people to demonstrate in Hue. Hue is a city just up the... Let's see if we can find Hue. So you get some sense of... Hue is right there. You see that? So Saigon is deep in the south, right toward the Mekong Delta. And then Hue is very, very near the DMZ. All right? So just so you know that in Hue, which Hue is also run by a brother of, I think it's Ngo Dinh Khan, who's a Catholic, runs the northern part of southern Vietnam as his kind of personal fiefdom. So even in his own backyard in Hue, the Buddhists can manage 10,000 in the streets. So there's this powerful opposition. At the same time, There are former regime officials who are publicly opposing the Diem regime. There are students who come out and demonstrate against the regime. Workers demonstrate against the regime. And obviously Buddhists do. Diem continues to provoke them. He sends out the guards whenever they strike. He crushes them. He raids pagodas, which is a sacred thing, injuring in August. In one raid, they arrest 1,400 people and injure like 3 dozen in the course of raiding pagodas and arresting all these people. Ultimately, in the U.S., by the way, the U.S. is telling him, stop. This is crazy. This has gotten out of hand. This is making the papers from Shanghai to Berlin. You got to stop this stuff. There's actually, the Buddhists respond in a very, very dramatic fashion, what's called immolation. They burn themselves up. In this particular, I think this is the photo here. This is a Buddhist who, and they were fairly savvy about this too. I mean, this is a level of commitment we probably cannot easily understand, but this is a demonstration in the most visible and kind of alarming way of opposition to this rule of Nyoden Diem and the Americans. So this guy goes into an intersection, and this happens several dozen times. It happens actually 8 times in the United States in the 1960s. 8 times that are documented. He goes and sits in the intersection, a companion douses him in gas and then walks away and he lights a match. And he burns to death in front of several hundred onlookers and dozens of Western media cameras. So this becomes a hugely visible problem for the United States. Now the United States is seen as you might well imagine, the United States is the protector, the benefactor of a guy who will allow this stuff to happen. This looks terrible. We're supposed to be the great liberal state, right? Our goal abroad is modernization, economic development. We have a huge foreign aid program to prove it. You can't have this kind of thing going on. Diem, long story short, Diem, there's another shot of a second episode to end at the bottom, which is much smaller. But Diem, by the latter part of '63, Diem is wildly unpopular. And the decision is made basically to allow for his removal. There are a number of these overtures like this. Americans on the ground in Saigon get the word. Basically, somebody comes to them, typically a military guy, and say, we're prepared to move if you're ready to have this guy gone. And time again, they would say no, no. In '61 and '62, they said no, no. In '57 and '8, they said no, no, no. In '63, they basically give the nod. The ambassador's given instructions, and he says, look, do what you can, but if you can't make the guy change, then Diem cannot be preserved. That's the quote. Diem cannot be preserved, which is very clear language for authorize his overthrow. And so they authorized the overthrow. In November 1, I think, Diem and his brother Nyoden Nu are captured, put in the back of an armored personnel carrier, driven across Saigon, and then loaded up. They shoot them full of holes in the back of this armored personnel carrier. And both of them are executed. 3 weeks later, Kennedy is killed. And Johnson inherits what is a complete shambles in southern Vietnam. And it's interesting to note at this point, Kennedy had no longer talked about nation building. Kennedy's deal was strategic hamlets and counterinsurgency. Kennedy spoke often, and Kennedy officials, all of them, spoke of a war in southern Vietnam, a war against the insurgents, a war against the communists. And they sort of forgot or didn't know or papered over the fact that the nation-building program from '54 to '60 had completely failed. And so they abandoned it. And they began to rely more exclusively on military kinds of solutions. Strategic hamlets, counterinsurgency. The thing continues to crumble. There is a brief period when there's a kind of a cause for optimism among the Kennedy folks. And I think many of you probably know about this. There's a bit of a controversy about whether or not Kennedy would have gotten out of Vietnam. And that controversy really stems on the idea that Kennedy, win or lose, planned to get out of Vietnam. That really isn't the case. Kennedy in '62 and all those around him are saying, I think it's Roger Hilsman who tells him, look, in 18 months, we're going to be done here. This is going so very well, because they're getting their stuff from Saigon. They're saying, we've got 7,000 secure hamlets. Everything's going very well. So Hilsman and these guys, and McNamara, who's Secretary of Defense, and Big George Bundy, they're telling Kennedy, look, there's every reason to think you can begin to pull people out. You can use this in your campaign for re-election in '64. This is going to work. We will be done. All their programming for Vietnam is ended in '65. Everything is the end of when they're asking for money, when they're laying plans. Everything, the end point of it is '65. They really believe they can be gone in '65. Not because they're going to be gone come hell or high water, but because they're going to be gone because they will have won by '65. It's a testimony not to their commitment to get out of Vietnam, it's testimony to their ignorance of what was happening in Vietnam. So Diem is killed, Kennedy's killed, Johnson comes in, and Johnson inherits this mess. And Johnson says a great many things. But Johnson, when he adopts this, he kind of tells people, like McNamara and these guys, look, I never really supported removing Diem anyway. And it's his way of saying, this is a mess. What do I never supported removing. This guy was the best thing we had. Turns out that, tragically, that's kind of the case. A guy named Duong Van Minh, Big Min, replaces, you can get these names anywhere, but Big Min replaces Diem. Big Min will not do what the U.S. wants. He will not, for example, make military moves against the North, for good reasons. He won't do it. He won't engage in a number of reforms, so he's removed within 2.5 months or so. I think it's by January of '64, he's gone. And a guy named Win Khan is brought in. Khan is K-H-A-N-H, I think. So Win Khan is brought in to carry out the U.S. program in southern Vietnam. Khan is, oops, that's supposed to be an N-H, I think that's right. Win Khan. So Win Khan promises to be more aggressive, but Win Khan kind of waffles a bit. He can't be trusted. At one point he complains of having like headaches and hemorrhoids, and he splits Saigon. He leaves Saigon in complete disarray, and he goes to a place called Dalat in the north, where he has a bit of a retreat. American officials go there and find the guy. One quote is, I found him practically a mental case. He was inept. He wasn't prepared to rule. He didn't want to do what the U.S. wanted him to do. So 1964 is often kind of viewed as an off year. And I put on here a political atrophy in Saigon. And atrophy is, if something falls into disuse and it is allowed to atrophy, it basically decays and rots apart. That's what happens between 1963, when Kennedy is killed, and the beginning of 1965, when Johnson decides to do something dramatically different. The whole of 1964 is characterized as kind of an off year. The political system is exposed for the rot that it is. He sends Bob McNamara back to southern Vietnam to figure out what the hell's happening. This is late December. This is barely a month after Kennedy's killed. Bob McNamara comes back and he says, this is December 21, 63, yeah. He gives Johnson this report and says, look, all of our prognostications, all of our estimates about the strategic hamlet program, they were way off. He said, we have been off in our estimates since July to a far greater extent than we thought was the case. And so he tells Johnson this. Yeah, here it is right here. He says, this is McNamara. The situation has in fact been deteriorating in the countryside since July to a far greater extent than we realized. What they discover is less than half of those strategic hamlets actually were functioning. Of the 7,000, they dropped the number to maybe 1,200. General Maxwell Taylor, who's ultimately going to become ambassador there, says it probably isn't even half that number that are actually up and running. And when Diem is killed, the peasantry overrun all the hamlets. They either escape from them and leave, or they tear them apart and then leave. The jails are thrown open. Tens of thousands of broken and battered people, men and women, flee from the jails, and they're singing and dancing in the streets when Diem is killed. So Johnson picks up this mess. He rides out 64, not knowing what the hell to do. He doesn't want to abandon John Kennedy's program. His big fear is that Robert Kennedy will challenge him for the presidential race, using his brother's, sort of Camelot-like image in the country to undermine Johnson and take back the Kennedy presidency. So Johnson has all manner of demons, too many demons to count. And he's sort of biding his time. He's getting some really good advice and some really terrible advice and some mediocre advice. And he just rides the wave all through 64, trying to figure out, what can I do and what can I not do? What makes me, politically unpopular, what makes me more politically popular? He doesn't want to lose in Vietnam, nor did Kennedy. He doesn't want to start a war in Vietnam, nor does Kennedy. Ultimately, in the latter part of 64, Johnson seizes on an idea. Actually, it's not his idea. It's been floated for several months now, that a congressional resolution might be the way to authorize or justify greater levels of military involvement. That comes in the form of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This is, even now, the conclusions on this episode are very, very murky. The gist of it is, in early August 1964, some North Vietnamese torpedo boats were supposed to have launched an attack on 2 American boats. I think it's the Turner Joy and the Maddox. On one of those, we're certain it never happened. They were mistaken. The weather was bad. They got some false echoes in the sonar. The second one, there's some evidence that some boat shot at some American boat, but beyond that, it's completely inconclusive. Nevertheless, Johnson takes what is this very egregious violation of international law, and he goes to he goes to the Congress, and he asks the Congress to basically allow me to defend America's right to sail in international waters, to defend America's military abroad when it's fired upon. With only 2 dissenting votes, they rushed through what's called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And Johnson is positively giddy. He says the Tonkin Gulf Resolution is like grandma's nightshirt. It covers everything. And so the Tonkin Gulf Resolution authorizes greater military involvement, some mild bombing, but it doesn't do much. It doesn't do much more than that. He steps up the troops a little bit, a little more military aid, and it still doesn't do much. And he continues to get reports in the weeks and months that follow. That really didn't do anything. He didn't believe the Tonkin Gulf gave him the authority to launch a massive war, nor did he want that. Especially, this is August of '64. In November, there's an election. So Johnson's not going to send in 200,000 soldiers. So all through 1964 and into 1965, in all these meetings, in numerous cabinet meetings, and NSC meetings and the like, people are telling Johnson, all right, look, we got to go to the north. You got to take the war to the north. That's where the enemy's coming from. You got to take the war to the north. And Johnson says, in one of his many famous phrases, Johnson says, I think I put it here. Johnson says, you don't send a widow to slap Jack Dempsey, which I always found, first few times I read it, I thought, what the hell is he talking about? And who's Jack Dempsey, for Pete's sake? Johnson is saying, first of all, I think this is very important to point out too, Johnson says, there is no stable government in southern Vietnam. You can't send the widow who is southern Vietnam to slap North Vietnam, which is Jack Dempsey. If you go and drop bombs in North Vietnam's backyard, you're going to get smashed. They're much more prepared to take you on than I'd like it to be. So instead, let's take the widow and 5 or 6 friends maybe and go slap Jack. So the point is, Johnson, and there's one meeting in particular in December where Johnson, no fewer than 8 times, tells those around him, we need a stable government in southern Vietnam. It's not as if he doesn't know what the problem is. He knows what the problem is. There is no stable government. There's nothing there. There's no country there. There's no political institution. There's no basis for one. And Johnson is kind of dealing with this. Holy hell, what do I do? I can't solve the problem because there's no solution to it. Weeks and months go by. Nothing's happening. They've implemented what's called the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, which gets above the 17th parallel, dropping bombs into North Vietnamese sanctuaries. Nothing happens. It does not affect the will of the Vietnamese to continue to fight. It doesn't affect the rate of infiltration. It doesn't affect the potency of the insurgency. And they know it, and they're all telling Johnson, nothing's happening. It's effectively, we're losing slowly. What are you going to do? And so they tell Bob McNamara and McGeorge Bundy come to Johnson on January the 27th, 1965, and they say, look, we've been there. This is what's happening. If we continue along the same policy, we'll go down to disastrous defeat within a few months. There's no other conclusion. There's no alternative. And they tell, actually, this is the, our policy can only lead to disastrous defeat. Johnson responds, and this is the next statement. Johnson responds, stable government or no stable government, we will move. So he says, stable government or no stable government, we'll do what we ought to do. I'm prepared to do that. We will move strongly. And so Johnson decides to abandon what had been the whole reason for being in Vietnam. Johnson's basically saying, we couldn't get it. We couldn't make it happen. There's no stable government. But by God, I'm not going to be outclassed by these people. I'm not going to be outfought by them. So let's step it up. It's a critical turning point because the U.S. now abandons its mission in Vietnam in favor of a war in Vietnam. not recognizing that really American policy was a shambles in Vietnam. Everything had failed. It completely failed. So you can bring war to Vietnam, but you can't get back the potential that existed, if any existed, in the mid-1950s. It's over. It's gone. Now you're just going to fight who knows how many years of war in order for you to be able to admit that it's gone. But it's gone. The Vietnam War isn't going to change anything. It's going to destroy a lot of land and kill between 2 and 3 million people, but it is not going to change the reality on the ground. And they don't find this out, obviously, until deep into Nixon's administration. And Nixon and Kissinger even are very reluctant to admit that very basic, simple truth. You cannot make it happen. If you couldn't get it done without a war, you will not get it done with a war. So, Johnson decides on a very different kind of a program, and that program involves heavy, heavy, heavy construction of a military infrastructure. Now we move from, this is a very different kind of a nation building. It's a nation building, but it's kind of a military base building program. Johnson decides on, I put it here, the construction miracle of the decade. And what they do is they embark on a massive, massive base building program all over southern Vietnam worth a couple of $2 billion. And they bring in and make use of the energies of 4 large construction contractors. These are exclusive contracts. It's a no-bid system. These private contractors are collectively known as the RMKBRJ, which is there. The RMKBRJ, it stands for Raymond, you don't have to write this down unless you just want to, Raymond International, Morrison Knudsen, maybe I should write that down. As I say Knudsen, it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue in a way that might make its spelling obvious. Morrison Knudsen, Brown and Root, and J.A. Jones Construction. That's where you get RMKBRJ. Raymond International, Morrison Knudsen, Brown and Root, Jones Construction, J.A. Jones Construction. These 4 companies are tapped to go and build a huge infrastructure all over southern Vietnam. Why? To make Vietnam defensible. That's it, to make it defensible. They're not winning militarily, they're not winning economically, which I haven't really gone into, but suffice it to say there's no economic base. There's no industrial production, agricultural production is way down, there's no tax base. Nation building is in a complete shambles. The whole thing is spiraling into non-existence rapidly. So in the latter part of '64, Johnson actually authorizes greater orders, greater buildup. It's secretive. Nobody's supposed to know. Lots of what Johnson does is secretive. So these military contractors, they begin to kind of quietly, at least if you're not in Vietnam, build a massive, massive military infrastructure. And this gives, they actually have a plan. The plan is, this picture kind of indicates, these are major base sites where they want major military, modern military bases, fully functioning modern military bases all over southern Vietnam. The plan is to have no point anywhere in southern Vietnam more than 15 miles from another military installation. I mean, imagine, it's a great big piece of territory. They want no place anywhere in southern Vietnam to be more than 15 miles from another military installation, preferably an air base. And so this is kind of a modest plan, the picture that is being displayed now. This expands considerably, and there are many more base areas and camp areas and lightering facilities and deep draft ports and the like that are not indicated on this map. But Vietnam is to be turned into basically a giant military base. And then they build things like airfields, bases, ports, canals, ammunition depots, military hospitals, dumps, warehouses, and light industry. And all of it is woven together in a very, very complex modern military matrix. It's epic what the undertaking that is the buildup in coming to Vietnam. Now, at home, Johnson hasn't made this decision yet, right? No matter what book you read, if you read any big book on Vietnam that runs through the whole of American policy in Vietnam, every one of them will say that Johnson makes the decision to escalate in July of '65. So Johnson, and then after that, the lid is off. I think we opened 1965 with 24 or 5,000 troops in Vietnam. We closed 1965 with 184,000 troops in Vietnam. And it all comes after July, or pretty much most of it comes after July. Is it 80,000? Is it that many? All right, from July to December, it's the rest. It's more than 100,000 troops into Vietnam from July to December. Then the following year, at the end of 1966, there are 385,000 troops, and then just up from there, 475, and an eventual peak of 543,000. In something like 3 years and 6 or 8 months, it goes from 80,000 to 543,000 troops. So Johnson makes this decision, at least publicly, in July. However, Johnson actually had made the decision to be prepared for that much earlier, deep into 1964. By August or September, the contractors on the ground in Vietnam were saying, well, basically they were saying that throughout the year, we're pretty much done. They'd been there since 62, 2 of them had. And they were saying, we're pretty much done. Our job here is done. It looks like we're winding down. No new orders are coming in. And then in August and September, they begin to get new orders. Suddenly, papers begin to shuffle across their desk. And they're kind of curious and scratching their heads. And what the hell's happening here? This doesn't make any sense. We thought we were on our way out. This is in January of 65. This is an MK, a Morrison Knudsen official. He said this. When somebody asked him about this, he said, quote, all we knew was that they wanted a lot of roads, a lot of airfields, a lot of bridges, and a lot of ports, and they probably wanted it all finished by yesterday. They want a massive, massive buildup. So this contractor consortium goes from spending their contract is worth $15 million, not all that much, $15 million bucks. By early 65, it has expanded to $150 million worth of construction projects. So it lights up like that. And it's very clear. Nobody knows about this. This is not making any papers. The Congress is not yet investigating any of this stuff. But Johnson knows. And the officials around him know. And McNamara knows because he's having to go and beg Congress for monies to do this in supplements to the defense budget. What they're doing is laying the groundwork so that by the time it becomes okay politically at home for Johnson to make that decision, they already have the infrastructure there to receive hundreds of thousands of troops. That's at least my position. That's kind of what my research tells me. You can't send 150, 200,000, 300,000 troops into a place that has no infrastructure. One historian has estimated that the soldier in the field at this time requires 50 pounds of goods per day. Per day. Multiply that times 300,000 in however many days. And that's not even including other equipment. Jeeps and tanks and personnel carriers and whatever, half-tracks and helicopters and all manner of weapons and bombs and then food and then messing facilities and barracks facilities and on and on and on. It comes up just in the port of Saigon, just in Saigon, by November of 65, Saigon is receiving 385,000 tons of military goods, just American military goods, every month. 385,000 tons of American military hardware every month in Saigon. That doesn't count the numerous other ports.
Is there any evidence that basically this move that LBJ made was coming from the Brown brothers influencing that kind of decision?
You know, that's people said that in the 60s and continue to say that, and I don't find evidence that I think what happens is these are kind of cozy relationships that are long standing. The Brown and Root folks have been in politics for years and years and years. That's how they get a lot of jobs stateside even. I think it's already a very natural kind of an avenue. It's not exceptional for them to be tapped by Johnson. Johnson's doing a good political favor for some good old boys back home in the same way that others are doing political favors for other companies there. There are actually 500 companies involved in profiting from Vietnam, 523 to be exact. So yeah, I don't think, I'm a little less conspiratorial than that actually. I don't think Brown and Root needs to push for greater war in order to get Johnson to do it. I think the larger question would be, are there economic reasons domestically that would make Johnson want to continue a build-up toward Vietnam? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think there are compelling domestic reasons for keeping up a war in Vietnam, but not necessarily. I don't think it comes the other way. I don't think Brown has to push for it. I think they're going to be swept up in it in much the same way. I was going to say much the same way as Halliburton today, but I'm not so sure that it may be a two-way street today.
Well, you know, it's at the time and even now with Halliburton, critics often talk of a conflict of interest, and actually I think that's dead wrong. What we're talking about here really is actually a harmony of interests. And, you know, as you pointed out, I mean, Brown and Root pretty much made LBJ's political career. They bankrolled him from the first, and they built the big base. They built the at Corpus. What is that?
Oh, I forget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were getting contracts, first in Texas and then nationally. And then, so it was just really logical that they would move into Vietnam with him. And I don't think he really needed convinced. I don't think, George Brown had to go say, hey, man, what about Vietnam? I think they kind of, there was this harmony of interest there, so why wouldn't they?
And these companies are not obscure companies.
Yeah.
These companies are, every year Forbes put out a list of the top 400 companies doing business abroad, and 3 of these 4 were always in the top 5. So these are huge concerns. There's no hard lobbying here. These are great big companies. And so if you need, just from a practical matter, if you want to build on this scale, you don't get 30 or 40 smaller companies. You get 4 or 5 great big contractors with unlimited resources. Yeah.
Was this the first time that, I guess, this kind of contracting started? Is this, because we see that today?
Yeah.
So is this kind of the first time this started where now large corporations
you and I were talking
getting
on the break about the parallels here. It's remarkable. It really is. As far as I can tell, this is post-World War II kind of inaugurates this kind of stuff where there's tremendous outsourcing or private contractors use to do what military crews had always done. And there are substantial elements of engineers and port builders and base builders and stuff within the military, but they do not have the numbers. Now, there's a political problem with that too. If Johnson lets the military build its own bases, what will that mean? That'll mean Johnson sends in military units to build the bases. How many? 2, 3, 4 engineering companies? How many? How do you authorize that? Johnson to go public and say, to build up an infrastructure so that I can put 500,000 troops in Vietnam, I got to send over 100,000 engineers to do it. If you send in private folks, who works for the RMKBRJ in Vietnam? Who are their employees? Vietnamese people, 41,000 of them. They don't write many letters home. You know what I mean? So for Johnson, politically, I think it would be disastrous if Johnson come out in, say, the spring of '65 and say, we need at least 30 or 40,000 construction engineers from the military, from the Army, to go and build stuff so that we can increase our involvement there. What? Nobody's anticipating this. But if Johnson allows this consortium, half of which is already there, to stay there and to hire third country nationals and overwhelmingly Vietnamese, no one's any the wiser. No one knows about this stuff. No one. Here I am, 2004, and there's not a word of this in any of the literature on Vietnam. So it worked. It was a marvelous plan.
Also, I guess if that's the case, then their shareholders wouldn't really know too much either.
The shareholders are giddy. The shareholders know a lot. I have copies of their shareholder meetings, the reports to the shareholders where they're bragging about this stuff. They're talking about how much money they're spending in Vietnam and how it's going to increase share prices. The shareholders do not mind. Nobody, even in the late 60s when this becomes domestically kind of volatile, I don't think shareholders are going to be out in the streets. You know what I mean? This is not that big a problem. Morrison Knudsen has a huge worldwide operation. So in the course of it, listing to the shareholders all of its stuff, we're in Turkey, we're in Iran, we're in Vietnam. It's one of many. So it's not going to cause any problem for shareholders. And if the prices keep going up, your investment's sound. So they begin this massive buildup. And this coincides with, actually it precedes the introduction of huge numbers of troops. And as I said, in late '65, 184,000 troops, a massive construction program, and a tremendous barrage of military power. This is when the sort of more popular version of Vietnam, that is the version about which there are scads of movies and fictional accounts and the like. The war in Vietnam at this point begins to completely tear Vietnam asunder. Massive air bombardment, helicopters and long-range bombers and the like are destroying huge parts of the countryside. They're still trying pacification, which is rounding up lots and lots of people and putting them into either refugee camps or other versions of strategic hamlets. The war is turning out hundreds of thousands of refugees. Ultimately, by 1968, there are about 4 million refugees internally in southern Vietnam. 4 million people who have no place to go, who are refugees. It's dramatic. The cases of cholera explode. Infant mortality rate skyrockets. The regime is spending less than 1% of its entire budget, which is in the billions now, of its entire budget on health services. It's less than any other country in the world in peace or war. So it's completely come unraveled now. And the war is not going to win back whatever opportunities existed 10 years earlier. But nevertheless, the war continues. And along with that, the war creates certain opportunities for not only Vietnamese but for Americans as well. There's this kind of common theme in the history that the Vietnamese were so corrupt we could never bring our good intentions to bear on them because they were so damn corrupt. Well, there's a grain of truth in that, like most things, but there's also tremendous corruption on the American side. There is an investigation actually undertaken by, among others, Donald Rumsfeld in 1966. They go to Vietnam in May of '66 and conduct this very thorough investigation. And Rumsfeld is shocked. Can you imagine shocking Rumsfeld? Shocked at what he finds in southern Vietnam. And they write this scathing report of everything they find. There's corruption, there's theft, there's an incredible black market where goods on the black market show up sooner than they show up on the shelves of the post exchange on the bases. And it's a terribly efficient system of just shaving goods off of the aid program to the black market. There's a several block area known as PX Alley, and it's the hub of the black market. You can go there and buy anything. You can buy from soap and cigarettes to clothing and whatever else you want. You can even buy military uniforms at PX Alley. So there's an absolutely overwhelming black market that is corrupt. There's also American servicemen are also very, very corrupt and take advantage of the currency, the very loose kind of loopholes in the currency system to glean millions of dollars off the system. There are American companies who are employing agents in southern Vietnam as kind of dummy corporations and themselves removing capital out of Vietnam by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the thing, I don't have time to go into the whole thing obviously, but the corruption, the theft, the cronyism, it's just unbelievable by 66, 67, 68, and there is no solution for it. That really is the kind of the tragedy of it all. There isn't any solution here. You can kind of see this plays itself out over the course of 68, 69, and 70, and finally the war begins to kind of wind down, but there's never a solution. After like 66 or 7, when you begin to when you take stock of what's happening in southern Vietnam, you realize, oh yeah, you can't fix this. There's no solution here. By 1968, Johnson recognizes that. He does a number of things in 68. He fires McNamara upstairs. He takes a job at the World Bank. And he brings in somebody with a fresh set of eyes, Clark Clifford. And Clark Clifford basically tells him, it's over. There's nothing you can do. It's a disaster. In January of 68, there is what is called the Tet Offensive. And I'm kind of speeding up now. I see that my time is winding down. In the opening days of 1968, the Tet Offensive occurs, and it's this massive assault of about 70,000 troops. Some of them belong to the insurgency, some of them are northern Vietnamese regular soldiers. And they attack across the whole of southern Vietnam, and they basically shatter the hope of Johnson, and they shatter the consensus around the war. Johnson decides at the tail end of March, this is just a couple of months later, at the tail end of March, Johnson goes public and says, the gig is up. He tells the American people, I will not accept nor will I seek nomination to be your next president, which is, for Johnson, who's nothing if he's not a political animal. Johnson bails. During that same year, Westmoreland is fired. William Westmoreland is the general who oversaw America's war in Vietnam. He's fired. Actually, upstairs too, doesn't he become like chief of the army? So the thing is becoming completely unraveled, and into this vacuum steps Richard Nixon. Nixon runs as the candidate who has a secret weapon, a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. And he wins in 68 in part because he actually had contacts via Kissinger with the southern Vietnamese leadership to say, basically hold out. Johnson at the time had been trying to rapidly secure a peace deal so that he could basically kind of hand it to Humphrey, his vice president, and say, Humphrey can use that to run on at least. Nixon and his people scuttled it and told, the guy's name is Nguyen Van Thieu, who's in Saigon. They tell him, look, whatever you do, don't agree to a peace deal with the Johnson folks. We promise you a better deal. The southern Vietnamese leadership agrees to it. Nixon, and that's not the only factor, but Nixon wins the election, and then Nixon begins to fight his own Vietnam War. The kind of tragedy in the Vietnam War after Nixon takes over is that despite tremendous death and destruction that follows, with 22,000 more Americans killed on Nixon's watch, I believe, something like that, Nixon never intends to end the Vietnam War. Nixon wants to get to a negotiated settlement that will be the basis, the legal basis for continuing to bomb the hell out of southern Vietnam. His policy is characterized by the word Vietnamization. Vietnamization, which I think the ambassador kind of derisively says is really just means changing the color of the corpses. Is it McGovern? Changing the color of the corpses, which means American boys stop dying, Southern Vietnamese boys start dying in larger numbers. So, true to his word, Nixon begins to bring back large numbers of American servicemen. I think the peak force level is 543,000. In April '69, about a year later, it was like 100,000 less. I mean, pretty dramatically, Nixon begins to bring the boys home, which gives him some sort of clout domestically, and he begins to step up the air war. He floats this idea that he's a madman. He tells Kissinger, tell them all I'm a madman. They can't trust me. I'm liable to push the button. They can't know what I'll do, so get them to the negotiating table. Ultimately, none of this is very effective, despite the massive bombing and incursion into both Laos and Cambodia. Nixon ends up settling the war in late '73 with the same set of circumstances that could have been had in 1965. The North Vietnamese army stays in the South. Nguyen Van Thieu and that regime is not protected. They get the deal. At home, Watergate is blowing up in Nixon's face. Congress ultimately cuts off funds, and the U.S. abandons any ties it had to Southern Vietnam. Nguyen Van Thieu said after Kissinger tells him some of these details, he says later, I could have slapped the guy in the face. After the deal is done and the ink is dried, they have a party at Richard Nixon's house on the West Coast. I forget exactly where, but at this party is a guy named John Negroponte, who was recently, didn't he get a job as ambassador to Baghdad? Right? Just recently, ambassador to Baghdad, who was also ambassador to the UN, and stormed out when the Iraqi foreign minister made his claim. Anyway, John Negroponte said at this cocktail party, he went up to Nguyen Van Thieu and said, listen, I need to apologize to you. We really screwed you on this deal. They abandoned their friends in Southern Vietnam, and of course, upon doing so, within 18 months, I believe, the Northern Vietnamese rolled into Saigon and the thing completely fell apart because nothing had existed to begin with. So it really is, it kind of ends with a whimper and not a bang. By 1973, domestically, the Americans are tired of the war. Nixon and Kissinger are tired of the war. They hope to get to a kind of settlement that would allow for continued bombing, but no more body bags coming back. They can't get to that point. Watergate derails the whole thing. And ultimately, in '75, the war ends by whatever had been built in Saigon completely crumbling, finally and for good, with no more American aid. We kind of end where we began. And I'm done.